Okay, so I'm not too sure if this recorded any of that, but okay, hold on. So this is going to be a video about how to write thesis statements. Sorry. I'm going to try to make it really fast to make it more effective. I'm going to send a lot of you back here when I give you your Unit 6 feedback, which is hopefully something I'm going to be accomplished today. If I don't accomplish it today, please harass me. So my screen is already shared. Now I'm going to talk about a resource that exists already. So this is where I'm going to record how to write a thesis statement, and then you'll see the recording that starts around 13 minutes because I was talking for a while and then I didn't realize that I wasn't recording, but I had finished. So this is from Harvard's Writing Center, Harvard University's Writing Center, and I think it has a lot of cool stuff about how to write a thesis and some helpful tips. So we learned how to write a thesis by making sure that a thesis has a claim and a line of reasoning or a why or because, right? So for example, if we're talking about gun control, if the topic is gun control, should we do it or not? And let's say I want to write an essay that says we should do gun control, right? Then I might write something along the lines. My claim would be gun control is essential because, and then I can say that it will lead to a sharp reduction in the number of suicides. It will lead to reductions in the number of mass shootings, etc. Right? So I have to give the because, and then I kind of telegraph, I kind of project to the reader what my body paragraphs are going to be about, what I'm going to talk about in those body paragraphs, which is good. You can also make that thesis more complicated and more complex because you can show reservations about that, right? Because you can integrate counter arguments into your essay. So arguments that are kind of attacking your position. The goal of integrating counter arguments is this idea that you integrate them and then you prove why they're not as important as your argument. So you can talk about gun control being essential, saying why you think it's essential, and then put while gun control legislation would take away certain gun rights and individual freedoms enshrined in the Constitution and the Second Amendment, and then maybe a because of why that position is inadequate for going against gun control legislation. If you don't know what I mean, stick with me. We're going to get through this. So Harvard actually includes a sample thesis statement here about the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, which is really cool and would have been really useful if units 7 through 9 were on the test, but they're not. We don't actually study the establishment of, we studied the establishment of communist regimes and governments in Europe and around the world, but that is not going to be tested anymore. Now it's just going to be units 1 through 6. A thesis should tell you what you plan to argue and telegraph how you plan to argue. That is what particular support for your claim is going where in your essay. So that's pretty obvious. Harvard then says, first analyze your primary sources, which are the documents in the DBQ. I put that little part. Look for tension, interest, ambiguity, controversy, or a complication, right? Try to speak to those documents. Try to realize that the documents that give you on the DBQ, they're not all going to give you the narrative of what there's no right answer, right? You need to interpret it however you want to interpret it, and then attack the documents that you think are kind of advancing a different argument with sourcing. A good standard place for your thesis statement is the end of an introductory paragraph. In our class, we learn, contextualization comes first, then your thesis statement. Contextualization should be about 3 sentences. Thesis statement can be 1 sentence, but I really want you to move and realize that thesis statements are most beautiful and most complex when they're multiple sentences. Usually 2, but even 3. You can anticipate counter arguments in your thesis. This is example of a thesis with a counter argument embedded in it. Usually use while to kind of set up. So the topic of this essay is about why did Michael Dukakis lose the election against Ronald Reagan? So Michael Dukakis was a Democratic presidential candidate. And then you could put while Dukakis' soft on crime image hurt his chances in the 1988 election. So you can see that that's one argument that a lot of people advance, probably in the stuff that this student has researched, that people argue explains why he lost the election. His failure to campaign vigorously after the Democratic National Convention bore a greater responsibility for his defeat. Oh, Dukakis, I guess, ran against George H.W. Bush, not Ronald Reagan, because this is 1988. If you complicate your thesis by anticipating counter-arguments, you'll strengthen your argument as shown in the sentence below. A thesis is never a list, so don't, this is a thesis about the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. So for political, economic, social, and cultural reasons, communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. I mean, that's good at telegraphing what you're going to talk about in the essay, because you can imagine that this student is going to talk about the political reasons communism collapsed in one body paragraph, economic and then social. But it doesn't tell me what you think is the main cause. And political, economic, and social, as I showed you in the golden ticket, you really need to narrow those broad, big concepts down into something smaller, right? So maybe political, maybe you could say something like, because of political corruption. That's more narrow. It identifies the problem. Political has anything to deal with politics. You know, that's not helpful. A lot of you do this, but that's okay. You're learning. A thesis should never be vague, combative, or confrontational. An effective thesis would be something like communism collapsed in Eastern Europe because communism is evil. Okay, so evil from whose perspective? And how does it being evil, is it because things that are inherently evil don't triumph over good? Or is it because people in Eastern Europe interpreted their communist regimes and governments as evil and they sought to overthrow them? Like, what is it about being evil? And evil is such a vague term and such a loaded term. So let's take a step back. All right, so it should never be that vague or confrontational even. An effective thesis has a definable, arguable claim. So here it is. While cultural forces contributed to the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, the disintegration of economies played the key role in driving the decline. And so you can see that they have an embedded counterargument, because they're probably going to talk about the significance of cultural forces in Eastern Europe contributing to its decline, but not being the primary reason. The primary argument of this essay is going to be that disintegration of economies played the key role in driving its decline, the collapse of its economies, economic reasons. Okay. A thesis should also be clear and as specific as possible. So another example would be communism collapsed in Eastern Europe because of the ruling elite's inability to address the economic concerns of the people is more powerful than communism collapsed due to societal discontent. So you want a because in there. You want an explanation of why. You want it to be lengthy and explain, right? And then you can actually use that, because that's where the bulk of your thinking in your essay goes, right? After you read the documents, once you write your thesis should be like an anchor. Your thesis should also be something that anchors that glues your essay together, and it should also be something that projects what you're going to argue. In fact, my recommendation is you take chunks of your thesis and then turn them into topic sentences and body paragraphs. And like that, boom, like all the critical thinking and the hard work of these DBQs is essentially done. So let's look what that looks like in practice. So for example, these are from the example DBQs that I wrote for you. We're going to be working with these next week. The prompt is using the information from the documents and your knowledge of AP world history, write an essay in which you discuss the political, economic, and social conditions that led to political revolutions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So something that I gave you is a DBQ pre-write and document organizer. It's on your golden ticket. I want you to use it just for you, right? Use it for you. You can put your contextualization there, just short notes about your contextualization. My thesis, put a little notes about what your thesis is going to be broadly. And then when you write your thesis, make sure you're as specific as possible. So you can see my thesis here. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Enlightenment thought social and economic inequalities were the catalyst for change. Social and economic inequalities was persistent throughout areas that saw revolution, were persistent, including America, France, and Latin America. Enlightenment thought challenged the authority of kings, which became viewed as tyrannical or illegitimate in some cases. So I'll be honest with you, social and economic inequalities, that's a pretty vague concept, but I'm more specific when I explain how Enlightenment thought, particularly social contract theory, challenges the authority of kings. Also, I don't say for social and economic reasons, right? It is more specific, inequalities. And so the reader at least gets some sense that there's unequal relationships that exist that people are angry about. And that maybe I should elaborate on in the body paragraph when I analyze the documents and write about the documents. So I would say that this thesis is fine, right? Because although social and economic are broad terms, I do give a sense that it is because of an unequal relationship, right? I don't just say social and economic reasons. So I hope you see the distinction between that and the theses that Harvard gave. Also, I will say that the theses that Harvard gave were very, very specific because obviously, you guys are sophomores and Harvard undergraduates are Harvard undergraduates. They're not necessarily just writing for Harvard audiences, I will say, and you can find a lot of value in how they write as well and how specific. But those theses are not necessarily something that your thesis is not necessarily going to be as specific, but you should make it as specific. Just because it comes from Harvard Writing Center doesn't mean it's not possible for you to do it. In fact, Harvard Writing Center was trying to create like a baseline that, maybe because there's a lot of foreign students that study at Harvard that maybe don't know English very well or struggle with writing and are very good at math. So don't get intimidated by just the Harvard name. You want to make your thesis as specific as possible. They're going to be slightly less specific just because of how vague and broad AP World History can be. I hope that helps you. If that doesn't help you, call me, beat me. You should be cramming now.